Okay, thank you very much, everyone. It's great to see a huge turnout for this very interesting topic, which is going to be about the algorithmic regulation or governance of transportation. Today, I have a great lineup for you. First, start with myself. I'm Rob van Eijk. I work for the Future of Privacy Forum as the Managing Director for Europe. And I'm very happy to be the moderator. And on my left, we have Karen van Kluizen. She's the Secretary General of Polis Network, already for more than 15 years now. And to give you an idea what Polis is doing is this network of European cities and regions cooperating for innovative transport solutions and making these more sustainable, efficient and safe. So very welcome and happy to have you here. Next to Karen is Kara Selke. She's the VP of Strategic Partners and Privacy at Streetlight Data for more than 7 years already in this role. And Streetlight specializes in big data for mobility. They measure how vehicles, bikes and pedestrians interact using smartphone as a sensor, which is a pretty innovative solution. So welcome, Kara. Then we have Ger Baron. He is the Chief Technology Officer of the City of Amsterdam. And he is also the President of City Protocol Society. He's been working for Amsterdam for almost 6 years now in this role. And he started his professional career at Accenture, where he worked as an analyst in the consulting department. And then finally we have Simon Hania. Simon is the Data Protection Officer for Uber. Before that, he held the position of the VP Privacy and Security at TomTom. And Simon is a trained engineer who learned to love the law. So this is actually an interesting hybrid. So what we're going to do today, to a little bit set the stage, is we're going to talk about things like congestion reduction, flow management of traffic, air pollution reduction, license management for bikes and e-scooters, which we now see everywhere in the streets. But most importantly, we're going to talk about privacy risks attached to these developments we see in the society due to the technology that we embrace. But we're also going to touch upon freedom. And this is basically a little bit further towards the future. What does this actually mean for us as a human being? And if we want to influence such a future, is it going to be the dystopian future, where the technology may hinder us or limit ourselves to be humans, or is it maybe possibly going to free us? So let me open the floor with the first question, which is about the role of governance and the different levels. So the question to the panelists, and I'll ask a quick response, and then we can dive a little bit more into discussion on the question: what is the proper role of governments in regulating mobility, companies, and further individual users of those companies? Maybe I can ask you, Karen.
Yes, thank you. Hi, everyone. Polis is a network which has innovation in its DNA, so we're really looking at all these new mobility services and innovations that are coming our way in cities, are essentially private sector driven and are arriving at a very fast pace. And the role that we see for the government is really to regulate, and in order to innovate in a way that is policy responsive, we need that kind of regulation, because these new mobility services will not automatically be aligned with policy goals. You already mentioned a few of them. We want our cities to be safer, we want them to be less congested, we want to improve the quality of the air. But if you just allow these mobility services to operate the way they want, those policy goals will not necessarily be met automatically. That's why we need the right regulatory frameworks to make sure that they are policy compliant. And as the lines between public and private when it comes to mobility service provision are blurring, we need cities to take up this role, to have this public sector oversight, to have an urban mobility ecosystem that is sustainable and is ticking the boxes in terms of all these policy goals.
Okay, thank you. And Kara,
yes.
From the perspective of collecting the data and also looking into the question, I would be very interested to hear your maybe also examples about this. Your response, please.
Well, first I'll say I do agree that there is obviously a role for cities in regulating the new modes, but I do question the extent to which governments really need to be collecting so much data, because there's so much that can be done with data that is not real time. That's not basically turning on the pipes. And I also question whether or not it's proper for governments to be in the role of being both a regulator and potentially also becoming platform companies.
Interesting. Ger, I'm really interested to see, why do you need all the data? How does this work?
How much time do I have? No, I think from our perspective, goes that, I think in these discussions we try to make the role of the government as simple as possible, but it's not that complicated to think of why did we invent a government. A government is an organization that should organize a few things collectively, making sure the city is livable, just making sure there's safety, making sure there are rules that are needed, etc. And I think everybody understands that you want to keep this as simple as possible, basically. So when it comes to the digital world, I think the same rules would apply. We need to make sure that the digital world is not a place to that's inclusive for everybody, and make sure a digital place is something where discrimination doesn't find a place, and it's a place where we make sure your data is protected like, you can expect it to be. So to do so, you need to put regulations in place, make it clear and transparent, also make sure you have enforcement, because when you don't have the enforcement, laws wouldn't work probably. And when it comes to mobility, I would say, it would be logical to make sure you have enough data to do these tasks, basically, making sure you can see that companies are honest, see that, there's not any abuse or whatever, see that data is not being stolen. And to do so, you don't need real-time data of everything all the time. Obviously this is useless, basically. It's also overrated. In terms of all these navigation companies telling you that there's a traffic jam, etc. We know there's a traffic jam pretty much every morning on the same place, and people still drive over there every day, basically. So it sounds nice, but it's the unexpected things you want to look at. So I think governments in general play a big role, and then the question, what's the local government? And then I will pass over to Simon. But in the end, you want to regulate stuff on a very straightforward, simple way on a European level. And I say simple, probably it's more complicated, but by very simple design principles. And when you go a bit more, well, down under to cities, basically, I would say cities are, they're facing now the problems that new mobility service bring to us. When you live in the countryside and there's one sharing vehicle and one sharing scooter, etc. Issues are not that complicated. We have a bit more issues when companies throw in 10,000 shared bikes overnight. It doesn't really work for us that way. So how does this work? So in practice, we now actually, well, I would say, use, not misuse, we use the regulations we can put in place, which are with regards to public space, example given. But in the end, it's about something else. You want to talk about the algorithms being used, you want to talk about the data, who owns it, who captures it where, basically. You want to regulate it on a higher level, but in the end, enforcement should be done on a lower level as well, I would say.
Okay. Well, did I hear you correctly and said that at the moment there's no need for real-time data?
It's always time for real-time data. But but you don't need to have real-time data on everything. Why would you? You need to have the data to do the stuff we invented government to do so. We don't need to know where everybody is the whole time. And why would we track and trace basically everything that happens in the city? Useless. We do want to know, basically, I would say, what happens. Is it a real business model? Is it ruining your city? Do your drivers, in terms of getting paid, etc.? Is the data being stolen from, etc.? So we need instruments to do that. But there's no need for us to get real-time data on everybody traveling to the city, because in the end, you can, even when you put it on a higher level, privacy will never be guaranteed.
Well, Simon, this is going to be interesting because we've had some background conversations, and the specifications that we see out there do actually deal with real-time granular location data. So touch in your response on the difference between planning and enforcement? Because
yeah, we'll do. But first, I think I still need to answer a bit of your question on regulation, because everybody knows Uber has had quite a specific relation to regulation, because in the past, basically, Uber was the company that fought regulation or ignored regulation. So it's important for everybody to understand we've changed from that. So we now realize that we are part of the ecosystem called the city. It's a bit weird to call the city an ecosystem maybe, but actually it is. Which also means that we need to be responsible to and responsive to how that city evolves. In a way, a city is a platform, you could say. It provides us with a road network onto which our services can operate. Some of them are even rental services on bikes. You can see one over there. And these, because we are a data-driven company, we enable efficient transport by cleverly using data from you, about you, to deliver that service. There is also an opportunity, there's a byproduct to generate data, to deliver data to cities. Now, I think it's completely fair, basically, so it's interesting what Ger is saying, actually with a design mindset on what do we need as a city, because in many cases that's information about the road network, how it's being used. It could also be about whether we live up to our permit conditions, because in many cases these are permits. But what we now encounter in the conversations we have, and now I'm touching on the point Rob was making, is that we are being asked, required actually, in order to be granted a permit in competition with others, to hand over bike-related location data. Now, any privacy professional knows that object-related data probably is not personal data unless there's people involved. Well, typically with bikes, there are. And this is kind of the first step. We need to start recognizing that these mobility data, although it's just pseudo-anonymous data related to a vehicle ID, needs to be considered personal data, and that hence laws and regulations apply, even when it's just pick up and drop off. But what we see currently is demands for fine-grained location data. Anyone who's been in telecoms or immediately thinks, sounds like data retention, to be delivered to engineers in city departments, and I can attest it's not Amsterdam, but there are a few others, who basically make this conditional for getting the license. Which means that it puts us in an interesting place, because this fine-grained location data all of a sudden needs to be delivered based on a specification that's actually coming from elsewhere, in how to deal with that. So that's the conundrum currently unfolding. Now,
can I have one question?
Now you can think this is just bikes. No, this relates to the future of transportation with connected vehicles, vehicles with more autonomous capabilities, and it could also lead to a next phase, which is traffic and transportation bodies starting to send us information to send to you about where they want you to drive or not drive.
I'm going to pause you there for a second, Simon.
Yeah, so sorry.
Because I see a burning response with Gerrit. And I would also love to bring in Karen's response, and Kara, please go.
Actually, a quick question, Mab. I mean, it's interesting what you say. I mean, I agree with you. I mean, I'm not sure if we have an official point on this, so maybe I say stuff where politicians have a different opinion about later on. But I mean, but it sounds pretty logical. I mean, sharing individual data from a bike is very illogical, basically. My stance would be, I mean, as a user, I would say, well, Uber doesn't need this data as well, except for knowing where the bike is, but you can erase the ride after payment as well. Mm-hmm. So our stance would be that we start to challenge companies, hey, can you do this privacy by design like as well, and don't collect all this data as well? You don't need as well for your core business. So we would probably say to companies, hey, you operate, we don't need this specific data. We do want to know if you park them in geo-fenced areas, if we agree on that, et cetera, et cetera. We do want to know probably if you, but we probably would say, hey, can you do this in a privacy-aware way so that you don't collect your data of users as well? That's not necessary for your core business. So
that's interesting. This is the first time a city is asking that question to me. Yeah? So, because it's always the other way around. can you maybe collect more data? We literally have permits in which the city requires us to collect date of birth and name.
It seems to me that
this is part of the conversation to be had. Yeah.
Now this is about the bringing in the operational requirements like de-identification and pseudonymization and all kinds of different techniques to perhaps do some processing of the data as you were suggesting, Ger.
Okay, now a quick response from you.
What I think we should keep in mind in this whole discussion, which has become a bit distorted, I'm not talking about this discussion, I'm talking about the big discussion, is that data and the collection of data should be a means to an end. So the first question we should ask ourselves is, what data do we need for what purpose? And this question is not always being asked anymore, and that's where you get situations indeed that cities are asking for too much data without even thinking about what they might need it for if they need it in the first place. And that's because the data is simply there. You know, for these services which are essentially digital in nature, there's so much data available that some authorities, I think, make the mistake of thinking we just need it all, and then afterwards we will do the thinking exercise in terms of what we can use it for. We want to really turn this around, and we enter into a dialogue with the private sector to see what the best way forward is. And we have a meeting coming up where we put our cities together around the table with you guys and your colleagues to start from that question. What do we need to know from a city perspective in terms of the actual impact on the system, and for that purpose, what data is needed? And then take it from there, then start talking about specifications, also, of course, the privacy concerns that matter here. But, you know, first ask that question before we move on to what data we need.
But I think we're making a little bit progress here, because we just established that it's not just vehicle data, it's data that can indirectly identify an individual, so the GDPR applies. Yep. And that means things like necessity, lawfulness come into play, but also secondary use. And if we can learn one thing of Shoshana Zuboff's surveillance economy, and is that it's not just about that you drive from A to B, but also about how you drive. Mm-hmm. And this is actually like the next topic I want to zoom into. Basically, the risk of the data used for planning versus data used for enforcement, because that may, in light of the privacy perspective, possibly change the whole scene. Maybe a quick response from Ger first. Is there any plans on secondary use for enforcement? Can you foresee such a future?
Yeah, so your question, I'm going to try to understand it correctly. I mean, first of all, obviously everybody understands you want to do planning and efficiency and give information, etc. One part, this is not the question. Second part is, do you want to use this data for enforcement?
Yes.
I mean, the interesting thing about that, I mean, obviously it's a different way to look at it. I would say yes, but well, also in a different way, I would say. The interesting thing is when you look at, well, I'll try to give an example that's, can I tell out in the open? But except for people who rent out their house via vacation rental platforms, example given basically. I mean, we had this discussion years ago basically on, hey, we want to collect taxes, could you please provide us who's renting out their houses? And obviously then you have GDPR, etc. You're not allowed to, and even more fake privacy statements. So in discussions with these platforms, or actually only with two of them, the rest of them doesn't even answer the phone. But with two of them, the two biggest ones actually, we had interesting discussions and ended up with, hey, maybe we should give access to data when we have suspicion of something. And maybe you don't want to involve actually the whole time, well, the procurement office, or sorry, the procurement officers or even judges, etc. Because I mean you get a ridiculous amount of bureaucracy. So we ended up with them finding out protocols how we could query their data, but only via a protocol where we had suspicions, etc., etc. So what I think is that we need new types of, well, we need new ways to do this, but when there's a suspicion, you want to have access to certain points of data. You don't want to do it proactively. I mean, people are innocent up to different is proven, but when something goes wrong, you do want to agree on that you get the information that's relevant in a way that it still holds, etc. So I would say that's a different game, but in a design, you should only collect data that's relevant for the purpose you actually use it, and not to see if you could follow people more or whatever.
Okay.
Now, it could very well be that part of those purposes, that data is there. And we also have to be sensitive to the fact that there are many more purposes than currently things like city planning. And we're talking about enforcement, we're talking about tax authorities who want to be able to verify invoices that have been sent out, which triggers quite some retention terms if you're not careful. It also means that sometimes you need to question under what conditions this data can be transferred. Because GDPR is not meant to stop this, but it's meant to condition this. And then you get into sometimes complex conversations because GDPR, although it's based on 20 years old laws basically, still to those who start to digitize is new, and they don't even realize that in some cases, indeed, these principles of data right sizing, data minimization apply, but also that there needs to be a legal basis, and that this data osmosis between public and private sector is actually more complex than people think because of the specifics that are in GDPR. So there is a real requirement to have, as a public body, good and proper maybe even democratic oversight or close to it of what's put in place. And so my question actually to you, Ger, would be, so in this example, in this adjacent space of home rental platforms, how was that constructed, the legal basis, to be allowed as a city to get into that data? Because to me, if it's real law enforcement, yeah, that could be regulated. So let me reverse it. The challenge I have as a DPO, sometimes I see these requests coming in and then I question, does the requester, the demander, even have a legal basis themselves to process this data, not necessarily being aware of the requirements of a public body? So how to construct and have that dialogue?
So we don't process it, we query it, just a yes or no basically, so we don't get the data, but just is it like 10 days, 20 days, whatever basically. And what we created basically is the same difference that you have in traditional enforcement. Obviously you have the police who has its task, but we also have law enforcement basically doing, well, giving you your fine when you park wrong basically. So we try to digitally create so people are certified basically to do part of the law enforcement basically, like in the physical atmosphere. So police officers don't give you your fine for don't having lights on your bike, basically. So we don't have access, but we can query it and just see if there's a suspicion. I mean, and this, well, went to several courts already and seems to be feasible up to now. But I mean, but from the need that we don't want to have the data, and we didn't want it, but we do want to have when we can't stand in front of a door of a house the whole year through to count how many days you rent out your house, basically.
I'm going to circle back a little bit.
And one addition. That I mean, it's complicated. Also, the government. That's the complicated thing. The problem of the government is that the government is very information hungry, basically, and we tend to think when it's relevant for the tax authorities, they should give it to the city, should give it to the economic affairs department, should give it to every department, basically. And this is where things go wrong, basically. And even in Dutch law, you now see that more and more. This is, well, you integrate several data sources to each other, and actually there are like hundreds of thousands of access to this data, basically. So we end up in a mess of connected data to each other at the government because we tend to think that there's the government, but obviously several departments have different tasks, etc.
Yeah. I'm just going to circle back, sir, because the things I hear are there are several interests. Yes, I mean we can all agree there's an interest of the city to process the data. There's an interest for law enforcement, but also for companies like Uber. But there's also an interest of the users. And what I usually see, and specifically in a conference here, is that the user is not always the center of this discussion. So in terms of planning versus enforcement and secondary use, I think it becomes very clear on who owns the data, who has control over the data, and if you hand it over to the city, of course, a lot of GDPR questions kick in. And the lawfulness question is paramount because cities do not have the legitimate interest legal ground. So there needs to be a law somewhere where this processing can be connected to. So this is a little bit of a summary of what I've heard so far. I give you a quick response still, and then I'd like to move on to the next question.
Yeah, I do see the concerns you raise, and they're fair questions that absolutely have to be addressed. I would look at it from at it from a more positive perspective in the way that these data are also giving us enormous possibilities in terms of compliance that works well for both sides, let's say. The digitalization offers us the opportunity to kind of make it automatically that you have to comply with certain rules. For example, that you cannot park your vehicle in a certain zone, that you cannot increase the speed in a certain area, which is maybe more pedestrian in nature, for example, and that the whole geofencing technology, etc., is allowing you to do so without necessarily having an individual impact on the user in terms of fining. You just will not be able to end your trip in a certain area where you cannot park. And this is what cities are particularly interested in, and that is also working well for you, I think, because it helps you to comply automatically with the regulations and the regulatory frameworks that are in place. So I would say that is the positive side of the enforcement story, and not necessarily impacting on the individual user privacy.
So Ger, I think that you already are exploring possible use cases within the context of mobility data. And so are there like GDPR problems you run into, for instance, when you're performing a privacy impact assessment? Maybe you can enlighten us a little bit there if possible.
Yeah, I would say, well, there are no issues because I think we're pretty careful. But I mean, it already starts with license plates for certain uses you want to track basically. Maybe we could obviously see if taxis in the Netherlands have a blue license plate. We could see if you're a taxi, yes or no. So with our environmental cameras, we could detect how many taxis would be around. Example given. Not sure if this is allowed actually. Reading of license plates to see how many. Often people go in and out, basically, obviously, is a GDPR issue, basically. I would say even, examples with rides on shared bikes or scooters, or etc. I mean, this is obviously the same thing as well. I mean, it's pretty much, you could, narrow it down quite well. We work quite intensely with navigation companies, actually all the big ones, I would say, at the moment. And there you end up as well. I mean, how much traffic should there be before you end up detecting that somebody goes from A to B, so you start to use synthetic data, etc. So continuously we try to have dialogues on how can we solve these issues to find ways that we could actually make sure the business incentive is not to collect as much data as possible, because then you create a market you don't want to, from our perspective. But obviously, I mean, when we could benefit and citizens could benefit of this data, we want to make use of it in a proper way. So so in terms of navigation, we see this, etc. And this is actually interesting, because then you end up, I'm sure probably there are Google people in the room, so sorry for this anecdote, but we wanted to predict how many people were in Amsterdam. So we started to build a tool that actually predicts how many people or in a certain neighborhood in Amsterdam any point of the day. And we can predict a few days ahead. The weather obviously is the biggest differentiator, but for the rest people are pretty predictable. But we want to have a starting data set, so we start to look at Google Maps, and then you have this Popular Times feature basically on the website. So we called Google, can we have your Popular Times data for let's say 1,000 points in Amsterdam? Well, obviously we couldn't, so then we started to scrape the website and start to collect our data, so we took 1,000 points from the website, and then, you're not allowed to do this, so then we ended up in an argument, so we only use this data after a login at the moment, but and then we could train the algorithm to make it better. And then we ended up with lawyers saying, well, you're not allowed to do this, and then I said to our lawyers, this is the best lawsuit in the world. I mean, Google sues the city of Amsterdam. Let's make this happen. This is brilliant. This is, I would say. So we ended up, actually, now we have a pretty good collaboration, actually, after having this discussion. So we now get data via APIs, etc. So, and actually, in that perspective, a great company to work with. But it's interesting that you, and then you end up, how many people should go, well, when can we use it? So collecting data for the public good versus for private good is continuously the discussion. Result of GDPR, but also, how do you use these things, basically? So really, when you can steal data, we can steal data as well.
Kara, you're in the business of collecting data. Is there also happening in Europe, and what type of GDPR questions do you run into then?
Well, first of all, a correction. We are not a data collector. We license data from various suppliers to create metrics, mobility patterns that show movements in groups of people. We are not currently operating in Europe, so I can't really speak to the GDPR.
Okay, and maybe like other jurisdictions like Canada, or?
We're working in the US and Canada, yeah. Because
the legal framework may resemble a little bit the European model, or is it more opt-out based there? Are there any privacy mechanisms to empower the end user, the pedestrian?
Well, in Canada, there is an interesting distinction in the laws. That there's one set of laws that govern companies like Streetlight Data and Petite, and then there's another set of laws, MFIPA, that govern the lower level governments, the provincial and the local governments, which could potentially create some very interesting issues in trying to ingest and license data.
Okay.
You said something about this real-time data being necessary, not basically. It means the data you get has do you scan it in advance basically on if there are any privacy-related stuff in it, etc.? I mean, because probably you get stuff when you combine it, it gets...
Yes, so we use only archival data, and we have a very high threshold in terms of vetting our suppliers beforehand. We have a whole series of requirements that the data is de-identified and that we only receive a minimum subset of the data. And to your use case example for City of Amsterdam, one of the things that you could do is use real empirical data that is de-identified rather than trying to use the Google peak times. You could use the real data provided that it has been sufficiently de-identified. And that is where maybe the mobility data comes into play, but you don't need real-time data to do that.
Karen, quick response.
Yeah, a lot of the discussions around the privacy concerns, GDPR, in this specific context now center around the mobility data specification that is coming from the US, that was developed within the context of the city of Halle, and that is raising major concerns also for you on the side of Uber and Jump. The stage we are in here in Europe is that I think there's an agreement that we should have some kind of convergence and not have each city develop its own data specification, because that would make your life pretty hard as well. The question is which data specification to go for, and MDS is one of the options out there. There are clearly concerns, and that's the exercise that we are currently trying to do. Look at the GDPR concerns that are out there, and depending on who you talk to, it's a major thing or it's very easy to solve. And just getting that clear in our heads and discussing this with the cities in cooperation and in dialogue with the industry is a very first essential step to take, I think. And we'll be listening to what you have to say in that respect. We'll be listening to other operators who say it's a piece of cake, and then we'll try to see how to take this forward. But we are not saying as Polis right now, MDS is the way to go. No, we just want to explore the best way to go.
So for all the technologists in the room, MDS is a specification of how the data, the metadata looks like, and it's on GitHub. So you can really look at what type of data is envisioned within this exchange between companies and the governments. So also stepping on your comments, we're talking about fundamental rights here, yes? So in the Charter of the Function of the EU is Article 7, Article 8. Let's move a little bit towards the broader question of privacy, security, autonomy, but in the end about freedom. Freedom of movement. Is there such a thing? I would like to have a quick response from all of you. And maybe you start with Simon first and then move it on over here.
Yeah, I'm probably preaching the choir here, but we also need to realize that data protection is one of the fundamental rights, which is also in support of the other fundamental rights, such as privacy, freedom to move, and so on. And that's a key notion. What I see happening is through these technical specifications, which create software, which embeds rules cooked up by engineers, we bypass the regular democratic process. Do we want this? Which effectively means that we could build technology that allows us to limit freedom of movement without having the proper reconciliation of the various fundamental rights. And that's potentially what's at stake here. And then the message to both cities and private actors is you are starting to invest a lot of money in something that later on may turn out to be struck down because someone went to the ECJ in the end. So let's reverse the conversation, I would say.
Sure.
Yeah, I mean, this is it. I mean, like I said, I mean, what are the tasks for a government, basically, to make sure you actually give as much freedom to people as possible, I would say. Also, I mean, you have rights as an individual, so we, on the digital side, we started a coalition for digital rights, coalitionfordigitalrights.org, with other cities, basically, to see if we can, well, get also this, everything that has to do with data, your data, into a rights framework, collaborating with UN, etc. Secondly, I mean, obviously other fundamental rights is, I mean, you're allowed to communicate, speech, go from A to B, move around freely, etc. So in our, even in our digital agenda, we put in, you're allowed to move freely through the city, basically. And the moment collecting data impacts your freedom going from A to B, actually it is an issue. That means actually that you need we need to treat people the same. They should have the same opportunity to go from A to B. So when you have services that are only for a small group of people, it's not allowed. It means everybody has the right to go from A to B. So actually here comes in as well, this fundamental right is also having access to the services and make sure they're accessible for everybody, example given. So, and I do think that, again, government plays a small role, hopefully, but it plays a role in that as well. You want to protect the fundamental rights. So we had discussions earlier with other platforms, example given, where you could only pay with a credit card, example given. And then we said, hey, this is actually interesting because, I mean, credit cards are probably 25% of the people living in the city who use credit cards, the rest of them don't. So are you now inclusive, yes or no? And are you now actually interfering with the right to go from A to B and make use of your service? I mean, it sounds like a very small thing, basically, but there are many things you want to look into, basically, to make sure these rights actually are rights for everybody, and not only for the people who could afford to protect the rights.
So, Kara, in your work, do you see any examples or tension with, well, basically the right to be anonymous in the public space?
I think there are some questions about the extent to which you can be anonymous in a public space. In particular, if there are multiple sensors gathering information all around you, and let's say that you have your smartphone and you also ride a jump bike, and then there are video cameras and so on. No matter how good we are at using fancy techniques, you have to consider the potential for re-identifying individuals. And going back to the point about fundamental rights, I think we have to really think about the consumers or the individuals, and that there's a huge trust issue. There's a big gap in terms of trust right now, and it's only going to get worse as we have more and more embedded sensors, more and more different modes. Then we start talking about autonomous vehicles and vehicle-to-vehicle communications and facial recognition. So for all the technology talk, I think we need to bring this all back to the trust issue.
The thing that cities are confronted with permanently in all kinds of decisions they take is finding the right balance or striking the right balance between what the individual needs or wants and what society or the city as a whole needs to function well from different perspectives. And unfortunately, those two are not necessarily aligned. When you take that to the mobility level, we see that the freedom of movement for one person may negatively impact on the freedom of movement of another person. Of course, you have the right to be able to move around without being tracked all the time and without everybody knowing where you come from and where you're going. That's definitely something I think that we should be very aware about. On the other hand, we when it comes to the mobility perspective, we need to take measures that will unavoidably impact on the individual freedom of movement, because if we all want to move the way we like it the most, then we will not be solving the major mobility problems that we have in our cities when it comes to congestion and air, clean air. We also have the right to clean air, not just the right to, or the freedom of movement right. So the impact of one person is always impacting on the on others' people's freedom. And what I would like to highlight here is also that there's a bit of an obsession with the data that is out there for these particular modes, such as the micromobility modes, but there are many other modes in the urban environment where we don't have that kind of intelligence at the moment, and that actually have a way more negative impact on the overall urban mobility ecosystem. And of course, that the car is the elephant in the room here, and that's also what I mean with a distorted discussion a little bit. Let's not obsess with the data because it is there, because there are actually other transport modes to be tackled first from a negative impact perspective.
And that data, yes, that data is all there, but there's not the same level of requirement to have the mobility providers share that data. So for streetlight, for example, there's no difference really in the data that we might obtain from mobility companies versus in-vehicle navigation versus the smartphones. For us, it's really all the same. It's just that with the mobility providers, they are actually regulated and they're required to be sharing this information. So it's much more extensive from the front end in terms of the collection requirements.
So I've been in the privacy debate for a number of years, and I've seen, for instance, the Wi-Fi tracking discussion in the public space playing out. Are there lessons to be learned from such discussions, Simon? Do you see parallels, or is the data sharing between mobility providers and cities a very specific use case?
No, it's not a specific use case. It's a use case which is an example which is popping up. What I do see is that in many cases it starts with data becoming available as a byproduct, which then subsequently people find, hey, if I had that data, I could use it. So then there's some proofs of concept. And in many cases, the people that use the data don't even realize there's people related to that data. That's also with the Wi-Fi tracking. And then you get the debate, no, this is not personal data. And then we get into all kinds of legal debates, and we coin phrases like individualization and so on. Whereas if you take a step back, of course this is data about people, because that's what you want to achieve. You want to do something to those people with those data. So that's one element. The other element is that what I then see is that those that have this ID don't have access to the data. So there's data envy. And then we try to gain access to the data. Now in the commercial relationship, there's all kinds of contract negotiations, and there can be money exchanges potentially. And in the interchange with the public environment, and actually you gave a nice example, there's some arm wrestling going on, because that's basically what you did with Google. How do I get Google out of their data? How do I get, so that's, and then you get, so it's a power play in a way. And we forget what we do it for, which is, and that's what you highlighted at, is to in a broader area look at what are the public policy arguments at stake, more broadly than just safety or just freedom, and then make sure that we reconcile and have that conversation, which is a tough conversation because it all of a sudden requires multiple departments in government, multiple different people responsible in policy who may actually have opposing views because they're not necessarily from the same political family, to work together. And that's part of that challenge.
So Ger, do you see parallels with Wi-Fi tracking?
Yeah, we actually stopped using Wi-Fi tracking last month because there are different ways to make sure you can do your crowd management. Interesting thing also about the example. I mean, you start out with your company doing just traditional services, and you end up as a data company basically. And then that's exactly, I mean, I think the biggest challenge we see as well. I mean, at the moment, data gets your business model, You create a different type of company, which need different type of regulations, which need different types of, well, to work with from a city perspective, I would say. But the biggest issue in this actually is that actually people give voluntarily, they give their data, most of the time they consent to it as well. Well, one of the biggest failures, well, I can name another few, but of a European Commission with regards to everything around PSD2, is that we actually give people the right to sell their own data to other people, or give it away to other people. You own your own data. And this sounds very nice in one sentence, but the big issue obviously is that you create a new market where data is a new business model, and actually people can pay you a bit for your data and to use it for all types of purposes you don't have a clue with, basically. So what sounded very nice, and 85% people in Europe Parliament voting for the law, is now going to end up in a nightmare where you don't, well, make sure you have enforcement in place to take care of people who misabuse this data. So actually maybe you should go a step further and at certain points say, hey, maybe we should find ways to, well, forbid, I mean I work for the government, we like to forbid stuff, forbid the trade in data and to a certain extent example given. So you own your own data, but you're not allowed to sell it, or it's not allowed to have a business model around it basically. I mean around healthcare data, this obviously is a very relevant discussion happening everywhere. But even in this perspective, I mean, you give your data to get a service, not for a company to earn more money with it to deploy different services, example given. So actually I think this next step of regulation should be put in place over here basically to make sure, well, you keep the business models a bit straightforward. A mobility company provides mobility service. The moment they start to work with data, you should focus also on the regulations with regards to data. And this can be, you collect your data to provide a mobility service, and then you start to reuse the data for urban planning or whatever, or well, entertainment business to make sure you send the right commercials to people. Actually, that's a different business. So we have this company, in the healthcare, we have these companies with Philips, and Philips says, hey, can we work with healthcare data? And we say, well, as long as you don't set your search engine and your own catalog with services, etc., it's a different discussion than you combine all these things, basically, because you provide data for one purpose and it's actually being used for different purposes. So, so two things I'm trying to say, basically. I think we should regulate the marketplace in data, and maybe forbid sometimes, or parts of your data to be part of a business model. So you can have it, you can use it, but you're not allowed to sell it amongst others, basically, or something. And I think we should come up with, well, actually, which you have obviously in GDPR quite well as well. I mean, the purpose you provide the data for should actually be pretty straightforward. What's the purpose to use it? And this is one of the big risks I see around.
Well, you're addressing two very key issues here. And what I learned from the smart city discussion is that it's not unforeseeable that the city becomes a data provider, data platform. And then the real question becomes, does the city allow to open up the use of that data by different consortia, of course, for different purposes?
It's interesting, after, I mean, end of the 90s, beginning of 2000s, and then especially in Brussels, open data was worth like 9 billion, 20 billion, whatever. When the government would open up the data, everybody would become rich in Europe. And now actually we're the other side, oh, we open up the data, oh, now people actually start to use it for different things than we expected to, and they're not making the nice mobility app, but they actually start to sue us or whatever, basically. So it's an interesting way that the promise of open data actually hasn't become the promise, but it created awareness actually that we should actually be very careful collecting all this data, and why I think I'm a big fan of opening everything up, but it also shows that we're collecting stuff we actually don't need, and it's not being used for things that to serve citizens, but actually being used to, well, at a certain point, repress citizens.
And who gets to decide whether or not the data is open? And should we consider that, you know what, we shouldn't be collecting the data that is actually created about, by, and for people, for citizens. We should not be collecting that unless it can be made open, unless there's some compelling government interest to withhold it, and just by default make the data open.
I think it's a very important remark you make there, because the real question is, to sum that up, is, are cities prepared to take that role of data custodian? I mean, we're talking about governance here in the end. It's, mobility data is an important type of data in this discussion. But can cities demonstrate preparedness towards that new role of data custodian?
No, but that's, I mean, that's a big question, obviously. I mean, the whole discussion around mobility as a service, I mean, the main discussion, I mean, technical discussions, etc. But I mean, what level in the stack you want to be as a government? I mean, do you want to control the digital space like you control the public space? Or do you want a bit lower in the stack and only want to monitor it and see what's happening? Do you want to own the platform? Do you put it to one private sector party, to 10 private sector parties, and make them have open standards or whatever? And mobility is a nice example, because up to 20 years ago, we were controlling traffic actually pretty much in Amsterdam, how they were going from A to B, because people are way more predictable than they think they are. Because people, when they visit Amsterdam, they plan to go to the museum, but they go to the red light district first, and then they go to a bar, eat something, and tomorrow they go to a museum. But that's 90% of the people who visit Amsterdam. Pretty predictable. And it has nothing to do with intentions. But I mean, people are predictable. So, up to 20 years ago, we controlled traffic quite a bit. And then everybody started to use TomTom here, Waze, Google Maps, etc. And then all these signs, well, they're still there, but people actually don't look at them. We could actually get calls from people who say that our navigation to the city is not right because a navigation company sent them somewhere else. Okay, well, actually our planning actually is the good planning, and they're doing something we don't want to, basically. So should we control them and actually provide them with, incentives, or maybe with laws, say, hey, you know, you should send them left and not right, basically. And do you want to be on that level in the platforms? Either you want to go higher, actually say, well, maybe we actually are the platform where people should register with their shared car, and we provide a ticket, and everybody could link to the ticket. I mean, so we have this whole discussion, where should we be the owner, where should we regulate it, where should we monitor it, where should we do whatever. And this is a very fundamental discussion at the moment, and I'm terrified that governments will be too high in the stack, basically, because, I mean, look at every IT project in government and look at the success of it. Secondly, I'm a bit afraid we'd say too low in the stack. There will be one company doing traffic management in Amsterdam.
So to give everybody the opportunity to put forward a point that has not been put forward yet, I would also like to ask you to limit it to like one issue, because then we can open up the floor for a Q&A for the remaining 15 minutes.
Yeah, just picking up on what Gert just said about mobility as a service, the way in which the public sector oversight needs to be translated can be different from one city to another. There's a huge capacity building and skills challenge when it comes to this whole data story, and not every city will be capable or able to the same extent to take up a leading role in that respect. But what is clear when we talk about mass is that there should be some oversight, because if you purely lead it to a commercial mass development, the modes that are being prioritized, the algorithms that will be pushed out might not be aligned with the modes that as a city you want to prioritize. Walking doesn't generate revenue for a commercial mass provider. So there needs to be oversight. Whether that means that the city takes control of the data, that's another question. And we see different models popping up, different governance models, and I think that's also fine that there will be different models. Madrid says we want to develop the mass app, we take the lead, we integrate public and private services. Lisbon says we leave it to the commercial sector, but we are setting some rules there that you need to comply with. So there are different models out there. But then I want to also play it back to the private sector. You all want to be the ultimate app. There's the walled gardens, there's the reluctance to share data, to be integrated into a platform which is combining different services, including your competitors, so that's another issue to resolve.
So, Kara, what is your point that you wanted to bring forward and did not come to the table yet?
Well, I wanted to just pick up on something that Karen said about the competitive aspect for companies, the mobility operators, and also other commercial entities that we work with. From our point of view in doing transportation analytics, transportation planning, we don't want to differentiate between the specific providers, whether it's Uber or Lyft. We want to look at mode share. We want to look at all the ride sharing. We want to look at all the bikes and all the scooters and whether it's electric versus just pedaled. And so there are many, many use cases where we can get so much done without having to deal with the most competitive aspects of this. And the last point I want to make is that while mobility is the pointy edge of this conversation because of the regulatory nature of the scooter companies, This is the beginning for what we're going to see in all kinds of other modes. And I think in particular about autonomous vehicles, vehicle-to-vehicle communications, vehicle to sensors, and then also bringing in things like flying taxis. If we don't look at and consider and do real work on getting standards done right now, using mobility as the forefront for getting this done, then we will have much greater problems later on once we are looking at the interaction of all of these different modes.
Ger, your final thought.
Yeah, maybe, I mean, I think we're, well, when we're in Europe and in Brussels, I mean, in a room like this, I mean, we probably, well, I think we agree pretty much on many things, basically. I would add to the table that the interesting thing, obviously, is that mobility used to be a very local thing. I mean, every local transport authority has a local focus with public transport organized on a local level, etc. Now we're scaling to a European level and actually going to a global level. In the trade war between China and the US, basically, at a certain point, the US said, 3 o'clock at night via Twitter, said Google is not allowed to trade anymore with China, so the Google Play Store won't work anymore for Huawei or ZTE or one of the Chinese companies. It's actually interesting. So they closed down the whole system, basically, with customers all around the world because of a trade war between two countries. Same thing goes over here. I mean, even companies like Uber, they're international companies. The moment Donald Trump would say we have a trade war with Europe, American companies not allowed to trade anymore with Europe because we don't want to. We want to have a fair deal. Probably you would shut down the whole system or something, or you could open up the app anymore or whatever. I mean, that's an actually interesting way how this would work on a global level. And to illustrate, I mean, the dependency on global players you don't have control on, varying from bankruptcy to a trade war, which is one button on Twitter nowadays, actually is quite terrifying. So we really should look into how can we make all these new mobility systems actually work. Also on a, well, national maybe it's not going to work, but on a European level we should find ways that we're not depending on international, well, wars, arguments that are not relating to this topic, but actually going to impact who has the data, who has access to it. And 92% of European government data is being stored in the United States. I mean, well, when the big data centers would get into such a trade war, you would have an issue as well. So I think we really should look into how can we make sure we make safe and secure that something very, well, human right like mobility is being secured on a European and a local level as well, and not being dependent on trade wars via Twitter.
Okay, point taken. Simon.
Fascinating point Ger is making here, and it goes back to your discussion on where in the stack do you want to be, but actually also who owns the stack. I would like to have some sort of a structured methodology to have that conversation, which also can create some objective measures and parameters to weigh things in a way that we can foster discussion for going forward in order to reconcile the fundamental rights, to reconcile the various interests in that way. And that would bring it also back to GDPR territory, because you need to do this as part of your data protection impact assessment anyway. And this is where I would encourage some clever researchers to help us.
Thank you. I think we've seen a lot of topics moving across the table which may have provoked a question with you. So I'm opening up the floor for a few questions. Anybody? Yes, please. Is there a microphone maybe for this? Or you can step up here. Yeah. So the lady first and then you, please.
Hi, Aurore Dupuis from Excellium's Cybersecurity Services. So we heard some information about cities getting data from providers like Google or Uber, and we talked also about trust of citizens in cities. And I don't think there is any framework that allows or explains how cities can access this data. What do cities put in place in order to make sure there is secure transfer of data from the company to the city, and that is not used for other branches of government? You know, all this misuse is going to happen once you have the data. How do you train your agents not to crisscross it with like databases you have on the citizens at the city level, for example.
Is this geared towards Simon, Ger, or
anyone
who's going to take the first step at this one? So this is about governance and trying to make sure there's no secondary use.
Now, obviously a great question. I mean, the problem is that you have, I think only in Italy, 40,000 municipalities actually all need to think about this at the moment and how to get the data, how to collect the data. In practice, there are only, I think, 50, 60 cities in Europe who are on a certain level that they actually can cope with data they get from private sector companies. And all these cities have their own ethical frameworks when you're lucky. And 9 out of 10 times the ethical frameworks are in somebody's head. So you're totally right. This is an issue. Obviously, you have GDPR in place, where you say when you ask for data, you should have a right, you should have a purpose for the data, and when you're asking for a certain purpose, you're not allowed to use it for something else. I mean, this is the consent you give as a citizen, but also as a company. So I mean, within GDPR and local, I mean, AVG in the Netherlands, I mean, there are quite a few things actually that are pretty straightforward. But I mean, the awareness of these things, the way the practice is actually, is a bit different. And I would say most of the cities don't have both the IT infrastructure or the capacity actually to do this in the proper way. So that's why you need regulations on a European and national level. But maybe Simon sees it differently.
Well, yeah, in a way I see it in the same way, but I also think that there is room for some coordination and standardization here. Yeah. Which is things like networks like Polis do, but also from DG Move in the EU, it would be helpful to basically trickle this down. And that could be that you can do it in various ways. It could be through standards, could be through guidelines, but also it could also be to avoid cities spending time and effort on reinventing their own wheel, which has been invented elsewhere. So there's also an opportunity to save us some taxpayer money there as well. So there's multiple reasons to cooperate.
And in the end, probably we will end up, I think, with some kind of a data utilities on at least national level, where cities don't have direct data contracts with data supplying organizations, but there will be some, let's say, data utilities who actually play a role in being a broker between this data. So in the Netherlands, we now work with the Central Bureau of Statistics. Every data deal we make, basically, we well, not give them to them, but we discuss with them, hey, can you copy this and make this available for the rest of the municipalities in the Netherlands? So they will be the data broker for certain things. So I do believe that we need some kind of a data broker on the national level who understand these things, because, I mean, in the Netherlands there are 350 municipalities. I mean, I'm pretty sure, well, most of them don't have privacy officers in place that actually understand these things, and coping with data is not in the core of their business as well. So I think we need new entities in that perspective in the end.
Thank you for your question. Next.
Okay, so during the talks we had a number of people mentioning about de-identification or anonymization of data. So of course this can be achieved to sort of differing levels, but how are you deciding whether it can be or whether it has been achieved to a sufficient level, this de-identification or anonymization? So maybe more to the data providers in this sense.
Well, I can speak to what Streetlight does. So by the time the data gets to us, it's already gone through a whole bunch of different steps. And we say we only want a minimum subset of the data that you have available. And we have to rely upon our suppliers to a large extent to actually get that work done. So I think this may be a question for Simon.
Mm-hmm. So in terms of, so de-identification reduces utility. That's in a way a good thing and a bad thing, because if the utility is to inflict harm on an individual, that's where you strip away the utility.
5 minutes remaining in the session, 5 minutes.
The opposite is that so it starts with very clearly defining what's the purpose, and then based on the purpose, determine what level of de-identification we should use. It's also important to realize that de-identification does not automatically mean that the legal framework of GDPR goes away. What it means is that you can better use the risk-based approach in GDPR. So this is kind of the general approach. This is not easy to execute against because it requires expertise and knowledge, which is scarce. So that's part of the
And then you have to consider it through the entire supply and value chain. And so you have to go beyond just de-identification and the multiple steps of that. Then you need to contractually look downstream at the other potential use cases and make sure that you are requiring those who are getting data, getting products from you, are also continuing to protect the data. So the de-identification is multiple steps throughout the value chain, and it starts with the raw data.
To add to that, so basically that could be contractually, so prohibitions on re-identification. But actually, of course, well, you probably know the UK Data Protection Act has a prohibition on that, which puts punitive or criminal sanctions on it if you even try. So they've gone beyond what GDPR requires. But so there are so the message is not just a technical exercise; it's also organizational measures that need to be put in place, verified and enforced.
We still have time for one final question, sir.
All right, so thank you very much for the interesting panel. Just regarding the last point here, I do research. My name is Halle Al-Momani. I'm from Ulm University in Germany. I do research in location privacy, and according to my experience in this research, if you want to achieve full anonymization, it's almost impossible for location data. Probably we all know that, just to put it out there. I just want to comment on Karen. She mentioned that every city almost nowadays, they have their own specification. We have many, many regulations around the world for privacy or data protection regulations. For a company like Uber, for example, or any service providers, they almost operate worldwide, and then they have a challenge and struggle in complying with several data protection regulations at once, in parallel. I'm going to address this in a talk later in the senior academic session. And one final thought, just when you mentioned whether we do have freedom of mobility, of movement or not, I thought that, okay, according to the GDPR, the people should be informed that their data is being collected, of course. And there's well-known research that when people are observed about some behavior or something, they change it. So my idea is, maybe it's just this crazy idea, is the GDPR interfering with the human right of freedom of movement? Because the GDPR implies that you have to be informed that your data is being collected. I don't expect an answer, just like maybe I thought it came to my mind. Thank you.
There's of course always a chilling effect. I thank you for that, for these remarks. This of course was not a question, so I'd like to take the opportunity to thank the panelists for this great discussion, but also you as an audience. I really enjoyed it, and I wish you a great lunch. Thank you.